I'm going to really talk about something that is quite different from what we talked about before, which was how people within social networks relate to each other. And basically, this presentation is going to be about how people within, in this particular case, a married couple, how they use the internet to manage their relationships and how they might have unspoken rules about what is acceptable and what not. And so a bit of this, just very briefly, is going to be about a little bit about the theory behind marriage and who we meet and what we do. And Bill already showed a little bit of the differences or possible differences that might exist between people I have met online and offline. I'm not going to make that distinction in this presentation. We're just going to talk about married couples who use the internet and how they use it within their relationship. So basically what we call netiquette in this presentation are these expectations about how you interact with others, in this case online, or how you use the internet, and also what is acceptable of doing. And obviously, if people disagree about what is acceptable, or if people within an intimate relationship think that their partner might be doing something that they don't agree with, the technology is there to actually monitor what they do as well. And one of the, because this is the same study that Bill presented before, so the study that was funded partly by eHarmony. And we are obviously very interested in, at a later stage, linking these things up with how satisfied people are in their relationship. So you could imagine that people who are less satisfied might do a bit more monitoring or might have more disagreements about what is really acceptable online. We don't know that yet, but this is definitely where this argument is going. So before I start talking about the internet, I want to talk a little bit about what we know about offline marriage. And it's kind of a little bit contrary to what a lot of people think. There's a lot of talk about opposites attract, and we fill each other in nicely. But actually, when you look at the marriage literature, there's a lot of what going on is that people are actually very alike. And there's research done about, does this happen throughout the relationship? So once you get to know each other and you perhaps live with someone, you become more and more similar. You become kind of clones of each other or something. But actually, a lot of the research shows that that's not the case, that they say there's something that takes place that is called selective mating. So we tend to pay attention to people who are more similar to us, and especially in values and beliefs, which makes sense, especially when you look at it within a married context. Because you're looking for someone who you're going to spend the rest of your life with, the idea behind marriage. And you will probably think that you have a better chance of doing that if you can at least agree on some things. And this might be some of the things that are different in cohabiting couples, where you find that there's often more differences as well than in married couples. And as Bill said, we would be very interested in seeing if we can take this research without further than just the married couples and make some of these comparisons. We're not able to do that now, though. Obviously, a married couple is a unit, and based on what we know about offline marriages, offline ways of interacting, is that they are very similar. But it's also two individuals coming together. And from a lot of the research that we've done on the internet, we know that individuals have certain characteristics that make them behave differently, or that are related to behaving differently on the internet. One of these things is gender. We talked a lot about age in the first session. It's clear that there's differences between younger and older people. And one of the things that we might also expect, especially when we're talking about relationships, is that it matters a lot whether you're in the first kind of pink cloud year of your marriage, or whether you are, you've been happily married for 30 years, and there might be different interactions, and I'm sure everybody has anecdotal evidence of how things change over time. This is based on Oxys. This is something Bill has already showed with whether people have meet people online. This is, let me see. This is whether people have a social networking site. This is a little bit older, actually, than that. So there were differences between men and women. We found differences in gender between men and women. We know very little about how this works in offline relationships. So we know a lot about individual differences, but we know very little about husbands and wives and how they differ in their internet use, and if they are more similar maybe than people, just to random individuals that are not together. So these two things I want to focus on in the next 5 minutes. Whether we can find evidence for similarity within couples, and whether when there's no similarity, so where people actually are different, whether some of this difference can be explained by gender, because we know that gender has some influence of what people do, and because these are married couples, all our couples are made up of a man and a woman. So that's basically what I was saying, that we're trying to establish if the same pattern exists online as offline. Are couples similar? Also in relation to the internet and how they use this. One comment before we start is that from some of the literature on risk perception, for example, or risk-taking behavior, we know that in general women tend to be a little bit more concerned about certain behaviors. They start to be concerned at a lower level of some kind of behavior, especially if it's considered problematic. This has to do, with cheating in general. Some of the research shows that women are actually more upset by different types of cheating, or say they are more upset. But also in completely different things, like, for example, addiction, that women start to worry about the behavior at a lower level often than men. And these are all very generalizing statements, because there's obviously also some research that shows the other way, but the general trend seems to be this. You've already seen this slide, this slide from Bill's presentation, so I'm going to skip that. And again, you've already seen that as well. So we asked 3 basic questions to answer this research question that we had about similarity. One of the first ones that we asked is, do people, and this has a little bit to do with internet addiction, do people feel that they spend too much time online? And because we had couples, we had the unique opportunity to ask the person if they felt they themselves spent too much time online, and we asked them if they thought their partner spent too much time online. And by cross-referencing these two, for the two partners, we can see if they actually disagree on how I behave. So if my husband thinks that I spend too much time online, do I myself think that I spend too much time online? So this is what I'll first start talking about. So what you can see here is that actually these two, so the two on your right-hand side for you, that actually couples kind of have similar images about themselves. So they are similar in the way they perceive their own internet use. About 12% of the couples, both partners think they spend too much time online. And 45% of the couples, both the partners think they themselves spend too much time online. So a little bit over half of the people have similar, well, let's call it self-images about how they use the internet. In 43% of the cases, and this is obviously where we'd be interested in when we talk about conflict or something, they actually have different perceptions. So in 43% of the couples, one of the partners says, okay, I don't have a problem with the time I spend online. And their partner says, I do have a problem, or the other way around. So one of the things that we wanted to look at is whether this similarity or dissimilarity, if it matters whether you are evaluating the husband and the wife. Because again, as I said before, we ask both the person to evaluate their own behavior and their partner's behavior. So when there's disagreement about how a certain partner behaves, what we can see here is the partner that is evaluated is the husband. So we ask the wife to evaluate her husband's behavior and the husband to evaluate his own behavior. So 53%, both partners agree there's no problem. This person has no problem using the internet, the husband. 25, so a quarter of the couples, both partners agree that the husband has a problem in using the internet. The other is partners assume that there's a problem. So in this case, the wife assumed that the husband has a problem, but the husband doesn't think he has one. In 9%, the partner, in this case, the wife does not think her husband has a problem, and he thinks he does have one, which might be strange. What we can see here, and I'll do this briefly, is that it's actually women are more worried about both about their own behavior and their partner's behavior. So when the husband thinks that the wife has a problem, she doesn't think she has one, but when the partner doesn't, that's in 8% of the cases, when the partner does think that she has a problem, or that she doesn't have a problem, actually 70% of the couples, the wife thinks she does have a problem. So it's more likely if the couples disagree about whether one partner has a problem or not, that it's the wife that's more worried that in this case. And there's a certain trend here which I'll talk about. Don't want to spend too long. So the second question that we asked to see if there was partner similarity was how they would feel if their partner engaged in certain activities. And this is really what Netiquette is all about. And we asked questions about emotional infidelity, about physical infidelity, which is things like cybersex. And we asked about other behaviors that could be considered potentially problematic because they've been associated with addiction. Okay, 2 minutes, yeah. So, let me actually go straight to we can see that in general people agree that infidelity is unacceptable. So there's a lot of similarity between the two partners because everybody is unhappy about their partner doing it. It becomes a little bit different for looking at pornography or adult sexual sites, where there are more people who disagree about whether this is acceptable or unacceptable behavior. For the problematic behaviors, we can see that it's a lot more distributed. So we could say that for the infidelity, there's a lot of agreement between the couples about that it's unacceptable, while for the gambling behaviors or the more problematic behaviors, there's not as much agreement, and the husband and the wife actually differ quite a lot in what they think. I'll skip this, but the gender differences, and this is going to be unreadable, but again, the general trend is that the wife tends to be more worried about the behaviors than the husband. Okay, this is the conclusions, which I've already gone through. Then we asked, last question, and that's almost the last slide as well, is about, we asked people if they've ever checked up on their partner, but without their partner knowing. So, and you can see that of the individuals, 20% have read their partner's email without their partner realizing. 20%, and this is something that we were quite surprised at, has actually checked SMS messages, and we consider that slightly bigger breach of privacy because you have to actually get hold of the phone to do that. You could kind of pretend that by coincidence you came across their email or they left it open and you checked it, but something different. So we then again did the same analysis for couples. We can see that in 56% of the couples there's no surveillance. Interestingly, in 17% of the couples, both partners were monitoring each other. Yeah? So there's quite a similarity in monitoring behavior between the couples, whether it is doing it or not doing it. And I think wives tend to monitor more, which kind of links up again to what we were talking about before. They are more worried. Husbands monitoring their wife while the wife doesn't monitor back is less common. But just a little illustration is that if the wife or if the husband is monitoring his wife's behavior, he has a 0.65 chance that his wife is also monitoring his behavior. So this is something to keep in mind. Okay, and this is the last thing I wanted to show you, the gender differences for the individual things. So it doesn't really matter what type of monitoring we're talking about. It's almost always the wife that does this more. And there's an explanation for this difference. There's 3 explanations for this difference between men and women. There's one is that men think it's acceptable for their wife to do it because they don't think she will do it. So they say, yeah, I don't mind. Maybe if she does it, then they get worried. So that's one theory. Second is that their wives, that they actually would like their wives to use it because they think that might improve the relationship. And there's some evidence for that with, for example, looking at pornography. A lot of men think, I wish my wife would look at it more. And then the third point is that they are actually justifying their own behavior. They do it, and they think, well, I do it because it's acceptable, so it should be acceptable within the relationship. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Right. In the time I've got available, Just explain that this is based on research that was carried out by myself and Dr. Ian Brown at the Institute, who's over there. There's a picture of him in the presentation. It's an interesting picture. It's not empirical research, so therefore it probably is rather different than most of the presentations here. It's based on our background as internet lawyers, particularly as privacy and data protection lawyers, and we drew on literature review, press stories, and background of the Data Protection Directive and its interpretation in this country. Okay? Sorry, I don't know. Right. Okay. Very briefly, I just want to say that although Stalking 2.0 is a rather nice title, and I think it was in fact Ian who came up with it, in this sense we're talking about stalking as surveillance. I'm not really dealing here, certainly not in 10 minutes, with the criminal implications of cyber stalking. That's for another day. We're talking here, as other people have, about the privacy implications, how you can protect your privacy, how your privacy is invaded, and so forth. One of the interesting points, I think, that's maybe not, I don't know, I apologise for not having been at the first session because I was on a plane from Edinburgh, but I often find this is not fully brought out, is that this is not a monolithic concept, particularly on sites like Facebook and Bebo and so forth. There is a spectrum from legitimate surveillance that everyone would agree is legitimate for some purposes by, for example, the police and the national security services, through to surveillance that everyone would agree is illegitimate. By, for example, ID thieves and stalking strangers, exes, etc. It's very difficult, I think, for the law to regulate for the idea of privacy and surveillance on social networking sites because there is no clear idea of who is threatening the privacy or who is invading it. So, for example, in the middle, we have a very grey area, as we've just discussed. Spouses like to check up on each other. I think cohabitees do too, actually. So is that kind of surveillance legitimate or illegitimate? Is it something we should be providing tools for people to defend themselves against or not? One above it, there's growing evidence in America that Facebook's been used extensively already for criminal investigations. And in fact, the first cyber stalking prosecution on Facebook has just kicked off in the UK just the other month. But in the US, they're ahead of us in using it in civil litigation. So, for example, you're seeing insurance cases where the lawyers are looking for evidence on sites like Facebook that the driver was drunk or was an alcoholic or bragged about his drinking prowess, and therefore this might affect his insurance claim. We're also beginning to see a growth in this country, but again, they're ahead in America on the use and employment dismissal claims. You know, so was the person really spending all their time on the Facebook site chatting up the secretaries? You know, there's lots of evidence lying around on Facebook. So as I say, there's something of a spectrum of surveillance, and I think that makes it difficult for regulators to deal with as a starting point. Stats that I won't go through, they're available in the presentation, which I assume is going to be on a website eventually. This is really just to demonstrate that Facebook, as you all know, I suspect, has the leading position as a social networking site in the UK, and that it was significant and worth investigating. And indeed, it's been obvious that we've had a Facebook bubble and that there has been a lot of stories in the press in the UK about it. It sells papers. This is what I'll go on talking a minute while you look at that. This is just my favorite cartoon from XKCD about the use of Facebook as a stalking vehicle. Okay? I'll skip over this because I suspect that you've already had a great deal of information about the breadth of data, of personal data, and of sensitive personal data within the meaning of the Data Protection Directive that is disseminated via SNSs. Yeah? So I'll take that as a given. Okay? I'd like to come to three basic points. One that I was in fact just discussing with my friend from the ICO over here is whose responsibility is the loss of privacy on a site like Facebook? And from now on, I'm just going to say Facebook, not social networking sites, okay? You can read it in. There's been a very interesting case last July that got a lot of press, and it was, as I call it, the story of the philosophy student and the Oxford proctors. No doubt very well known to the Oxford visitors, yeah? So basically, I understand Oxford has rules about what you're allowed to do after you finish your exams. And there's a long history, as indeed there was at Cambridge, which is where I went, of people going slightly crazy after they finish their finals, and they run out in the streets and they drink too much, and they throw flour at each other and they throw talcum powder at each other, which I think must make glue, which can't be very pleasant. And this causes general disruption to the leans. So it's not allowed under disciplinary rules, yeah? but it's difficult to crack down on. So what they did last year was the proctors apparently used the facilities of Facebook to try and look for photos of people not caught in the act, but actually bragging about this to some extent. And indeed, they found pictures, and I think that's one of them. There's Ms. Alex Hill, covered in a nice mixture of talcum powder and flour. So she was caught and she was disciplined in some way or another. She went to the press. Various people went to the press. The Students' Union said it was appalling. It was a disgraceful intrusion into their privacy. Ms. Alex Hill was quoted as saying, I don't know, she said that 3 of her photos provided evidence that she had engaged in disorderly conduct. I don't know how the proctors got access to it, she said. I thought my privacy settings were such that only students could see my pictures. They cited 3 links to pictures on my Facebook profile where I've got shaving foam all over me. I'm outraged. It's truly bizarre that they're paying staff to sit and go through Facebook. So she has what I've called an expectation of privacy there, yeah? The question is, in legalistic terms, is it a reasonable expectation of privacy? Both are important. What should she expect of the site and what would be reasonable? So what is interesting that comes through the research time and again is that although we as rational actors say you put something on the internet and it's available to everybody, the perception, particularly by young persons, but also as has been said by less experienced adult users of the internet, is that they are in some kind of private club. It's an interesting intermediate sphere. This comes right back to the research that Dana Boyd did and so forth, and Barnes in the US, that they don't think that they're alone, but they think they are really kind of surrounded by their friends and they don't really imagine that anyone else will look. Whereas, in fact, if you talk to any, policemen, etc., they will tell you that ID thieves are sitting there going through the data that is handily lying around on Facebook. Not to mention the stalkers, the spouses, and the marketers, and the spammers, and all the rest of them. So it's not a private space at all. But that was clearly her perception. Now, was her perception completely flawed again? Because I've used this example with various people, and usually they say, how stupid could she have been? She was a maths and philosophy student at Oxford. Shouldn't she have realized that the proctors could see her doing these bad things? But actually, she may not have been so stupid because, as Ian pointed out to me originally, Facebook has this default setting, which I'm sure has been mentioned, that if you're in a network, such as the Oxford network, the Edinburgh network, the London network, a network that is not tied to an institution, then by default, anyone in that network can see all of your personal details, including your photos. Now, this originates from the origins of Facebook as basically a kind of high school yearbook, where it made some kind of sense because everyone who would be in your network would have an email address for that college or school. But when the concept of networks was extended to towns and cities, then it makes very little sense at all because people may well join the network simply because they want to know what's going on there, for example, what the events are, what the availability of options are, yeah? So she was in the Oxford network. It's quite likely that the proctors were in the Oxford network. They may well have had access to her photos without her reasonably perhaps knowing that, unless she'd read the privacy policy of Facebook in detail. Now again, if you take a standard legalistic contractual attitude, when you sign an agreement, which is effectively what you're doing when you sign up for Facebook, you are deemed to have read the agreement. That works for commercial contracts. It does not work for social networking sites. I think if we asked everyone in this room if they've ever read the Facebook privacy policy, me too, but we work in that area. Would we get very many hands? And certainly not very many, I suspect, from the 13 to 24-year-old group. So maybe she wasn't so stupid after all. Which takes me to a point that I'll come back to at the end, so I'll skip that in the interest of time. I want to emphasize 2 points more. The argument tends very much to be a sort of on-off one about social networking sites as a place of risk for disclosure. We say people give away a lot of personal data and they don't think twice about it. Oh dear. It is actually more nuanced than that. For a start, again, our Ms. Hill might in fact have been quite careful about her privacy. She might have been defeated by the network concept. It might have been that the pictures that were put up were tagged with her name by third parties. Now again, the privacy settings of Facebook are actually quite sophisticated if you're a sophisticated user and you're willing to sit down and spend a lot of time on it. But for the average person, they're completely opaque. And although it does technically supply you with the means to stop third parties tagging your photos, I hardly know of anyone who knows how to do that, yeah? Let alone perhaps Ms. Hill. So that may have been a reason, and this exemplifies a general trend in Facebook, which is that it's hard to stop your data leaking to third parties, yeah? So to some extent, it's difficult to stop third parties tagging and identifying photos of you. If you're not even on Facebook, people may still put up pictures of you and tag them, and you won't even know. There's no compulsory email, for example, sent by Facebook to the person saying, do you know that your friend X has tagged you at this URL, which would be a very simple thing for them to do. One of the big appealing factors in Facebook, which is supposed to have propelled it to its #1 position in the SNS stakes, is the provision of third-party applications or apps. Now, again, it would be nice if we had more time to find out who knows what about Facebook, but certainly I'm a regular user, and apps are very appealing. You can use apps to send people birthday greetings, to play Scrabble with them, to turn them into zombies, you know, to send them virtual bunches of flowers. You can do all these kind of things. In each case, invariably, so it must be a template set up by Facebook, you are commanded, essentially, to give away all the data that Facebook holds about you, or you cannot use the application. There is a complete illusory sense of consent here. If you untick any of the crucial boxes there, the application goes away. The choice is not, will I give some of my personal data and use the application? The choice is application or no application. And furthermore, to add to the problem, these applications have become viral. Okay? By which I mean that when you get an email when you're on Facebook saying, your friend just compared you to someone else and said that you were the person that they'd third most like to go shopping with, you go, ooh, I want to go and have a look at that and see who else was compared to someone, and did they say I was the hottest as well? And when you go there, you find that you've received an email that's asking you to sign up to this as well. And then you're asked to sign up 15 of your friends before you can see the results. So it's viral in that sense, in that these applications breed and they prey on your curiosity to spread the disclosure of personal data to these applications to your entire friends list, yeah? I've actually shown pictures of both of my collaborators there, but we'll skip over that in extremely unflattering mode. So where does this get us? There's this point that Facebook not only encourages disclosure, but also provides an illusory sense of privacy, takes from you illusory consent, which is neither freely given nor informed, and that it's very, very easy then for data to leak to third parties, such as the provider of these applications, who are only responsible to Facebook by contract. They have no direct contractual relationship with the user, and very often when the user signs up for the application, the terms and conditions are not even available. So there is not even the illusion of transparency and informed consent, which there is at least when you sign up to Facebook. How much time have I got?
You passed the time.
Okay, right, 2 more minutes, all right then. A couple of points to conclude from this then, okay, because I just wanted to get to the more radical suggestion. There is a great deal of suggestion that the answer to everything in this area is education of the users. That's what you tend to see when you look at the Get Safe Online, when you look at the ICO current guidance, I'm afraid, for children and networking, when you look at what's going on in Australia, when you look at what's going on in other jurisdictions that have thought about it. I don't think that is the answer. I think that the users are in an impossible position where they're placed in choosing between jam today, by which I mean access to the cool kids and the cool parties, the social networking benefits, and thinking about the dim, unaccessible risks of tomorrow, which will only become real to them generally about 10 years later, perhaps, okay? And I'm sure we've already had evidence from the Ofcom report that kids especially simply aren't physically equipped to make those kind of sensitive risk assessment analyses. They haven't got the right synapses yet, okay? So what can we do, all right, when we're talking about solutions? As I just said, I don't think education's the answer. I think it's sugar wrapping. It makes it look like policymakers are doing something. I don't think it's law, because in each case, Facebook can usually, or the SNS, can hold up its hands and say, we got consent. What more do you want? You know, and consent is the answer to processing of personal data under data protection. So I think what you're looking for is code solutions, you know, and there is some move towards this. There are actually some social networking sites out there, usually for minorities who are a bit worried about their privacy, like say gay people or transsexual people or Jewish people, where the code has been used to make the site still a networking environment, but private to the outsiders, which is indeed the reasonable expectation of the users. So how could you achieve that using basically defaults? I've given you one example already. If you took the network default of Facebook and reversed it, so that basically you would have to opt in to making your site details available to everyone in your network, that would be a clear and transparent choice. You still have the problem about risk assessment, but at least it would be more clear and transparent, yeah? And I had a few more suggestions that actually aren't on the slides. One, which I borrowed from Victor Meyer-Schönberger, is why don't we simply make these profiles renewable every 6 months? You know, one of the points is that they stay up forever. And again, I've just heard that the ICO is still having trouble with, you know, Facebook's problem with data retention and the fact that the profiles don't go away. Yeah? Why don't we just let them expire every 6 months and people can come back and say, okay, I still want to party, you know? Another point is, why can't we have a start from zero? Why don't we have a start from the assumption that everything is hidden, everything is locked down? That's how I have my profile, okay? Now you say that's insane. People want to go on these to network socially. That's what they're for, okay? So you start off, as it were, in a state of privacy, and you give them a little installation startup routine, just like you do when you install Microsoft Windows or BitTorrent or any of the other things, okay? We have a good technology of doing this, in which it says, basically, who do you want to show your data to? What data do you want to show? Perhaps how long do you want to show this data for? Most of these sites now have the capacity also of providing you with granular privacy, which I don't think has been mentioned up till now. It isn't just disclose all or disclose nothing. It's disclosed to these friends and not to the people at work or not to these parents, yeah? So we could go for custom friends groups as a default option as well. And I think we could work with code and defaults to provide a much clearer and simpler and more privacy sensitive scenario for indeed both the site and the users and the policymakers, and that's it.
Thank you.
I obviously express and disclose my professional interest as running Match.com across Europe, and we have an application on Facebook as well. But I did want to sort of bring the conversation back to something that Bill mentioned earlier about that. Personally, I'm passionate about the power of the web for social good as well. So I think there's some comments here about surveillance and obviously about data protection. But in my personal experience, in my professional capacity, it's not a huge issue for most people that use our services and the services I've been looking at for the last sort of 9 or 10 years since I was involved with lastminute.com. There was a couple of things though. The notion of surveillance worried me in particular, and whether I did a straw poll in my office. I've got about 30 people in my office in the UK. And I wondered whether it was a cipher for a bigger issue about trust in society or trust on the web overall. But in my own office, it was surprising that all of the women categorically said they had used some method of surveillance on their partners. And all of the men showed absolute shock and horror about this. Whether that says something about the women that work for me or whether it says something about men being untrustworthy, I'm not sure. But, you know, I thought, for me, it's the way that technology gives us an ability to do things that we would more normally do. I think that might be an interesting discussion. The other thing was drawn out by the study this morning was about whether age matters. I mean, I noticed in Ellen's study that it's skewed quite high, average age of 49. And, you know, whether the distinction between netiquette, etiquette on or offline world, whether that'll even exist with generations coming through. And this notion of, you know, digital immigrants and digital natives, we've had to get used to, my generation had to get used to this new technology. But certainly my niece, who I was speaking to at the weekend by IM, you know, 9 o'clock at night, why she was up at that hour is a different question, but she was on IM to me. And I think about it's an everyday part of her life to use this technology, and it's completely seamless. And then the final thing really is about the role that business has to play in this. And again, excuse the plug, but you know, for me, within the dating category, there are a number of websites that exist further down the moral spectrum. And I think business and the corporate world has a responsibility to set up, you know, a freedom for people to interact as frequently and in the manner that they choose to. But at the same time, there's a responsibility to make sure that there are safety and security procedures in place. At Match.com, we check every single profile, every single person that comes on the site to make sure that there's a certain etiquette and a behaviour. And also the intention of the people that come to someone like Match.com is very different. I mean, as much as that people are looking to find love, whether the end goal is marriage or not is irrelevant to us. It's really about trying to find that special someone. So I think, you know, it's the responsibility of business to make sure that we set up environments that are conducive to types of behaviour while not trying to act as the moral guardians to behaviour on the web, because I don't think that should be our ultimate role. And then the final thing was something that I want to talk to Bill and Ellen about later, but whether, you know, I'd be really interested about whether there's some research that shows that there is a qualitative difference between people that meet through the web or whether they meet through more traditional means. I think this is going to get blurred as we get older and the boundaries become less distinct. But, you know, the idea to set your criteria of why you want to meet people through interests or through shared passions, I think in many ways set up a filtering process that get you through that, the way you meet someone in a bar, maybe having had a few drinks, that maybe it avoids that situation whereby you might make some of the wrong decisions earlier on, and whether over the long term the technology will be used, as I say, as a force for social good and an ability to help people engender longer term and more rewarding relationships.
Okay, some of you are probably thinking whether online came too late for you.
I know Bill mentioned this a couple of times today. I'll have a conversation with him later about a free subscription to Matchmaker.
Good. Okay, Ian, we'll move to you and then we'll open it up. Thank you, Jason.
So actually, following on from some of what Jason said and Lilian has said, some of the things I'm interested in finding more out about. First of all, what is the role for regulators for Ofcom? If the answer isn't education, if the answer isn't media literacy, I do share Lilian's concerns that is not the whole answer. I mean, has anyone in here, a straw poll, actually spent serious time modifying the privacy settings on their Facebook profiles or their social networking? So actually, that's a lot. You know, normally when I ask that to an audience, that's, you know, usually maybe one person might sort of sheepishly put their hands up, and I think that's I think that's an important thing to ask in research. So it was interesting to hear from Ofcom about the percentage of young people who thought that their profile was only available to their friends. I'd be very interested to know in the follow-up, which is, okay, in reality, if you had sat down with the person being interviewed and looked at the settings, would it actually be the case that their profile was only available to their friends? And I think that's an important role for research. Some specific questions for Ellen's, which I found really interesting. I think the whole idea of, I don't know why, if it's just me, the thing that I found most interesting was cyber infidelity. You know, what is it that people think is fidelity and infidelity online? Ellen had some of the specific behaviours that you would ask people about. You know, you could have all sorts of other ones like, would I feel it was in my partner was being unfaithful, perhaps by having an ex-partner as one of their friends, or texting them every day, messaging them every day, sharing photos with them? You know, where exactly does that line lie? I wondered as well, we've heard a lot about the positive, optimistic side of marriage and strengthening marriage and helping people make new relationships. Well, you know, obviously then there's the converse. What behaviours perhaps could you measure that you could use to predict, to say, well, it's unlikely that this couple will still be together in a year's time if they're using these sites in this way? And that relates to another, my final question, I think. Are there distinct relationship styles that people have offline and online? And if there are, do they correlate? You know, are there some people who are the sort of, you know, the open marriage? You know, what is the equivalent of an open marriage on Facebook? Is it that you've got every previous girlfriend or boyfriend you ever had, and you're still, you know, you're all sending each other happy photos and spending a lot of time online? I don't know. I'd be interested in that.
It's complicated.
Okay.